Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal.
Joe, this is the big one. We are about to ruin our most long-running joke, all for this.
What is our next most running joke? Anyway, yes, we are ruining a lot. So we've joked for years and years and years about how we should do an episode on the Jones Act because it's come up, obviously, in dozens of episodes. We did actually talk about it quite a bit in different contexts, but we've never done an episode actually talking about the infamous law.
That's right. And since we waited so long, I guess, we had to do it a little bit differently.
In style. We had to do it in style.
Yep. So for those of us who came to our live event in Washington, D.C. recently, you will have seen exactly what format we did this in. But it's a debate. So we had someone who is pro-Jones Act debating with someone who is anti-Jones Act live on stage. Things got heated. Things got emotional, but always entertaining and informative.
It was heated. You know, I've joked, like people have very strong feelings about the Jones Act. And when we did it live on stage, we separated our two guests at the end of the stage, sort of tongue in cheek, but actually, it was like really intense and people feel very strongly about this law, which restricts if you're going to ship something from one point in the U.S. to another point in the U.S. by water, it has to be on a U.S. built and U.S. crewed and U.S. flagged ship. People feel very strongly about this law.
That's right. And it's kind of interesting also to look at it as a little petri dish of industrial policy,
That's
which
right.
I think is one of the reasons we first started getting interested in this, along with a lot of the supply chain disruptions that we were experiencing around the pandemic time. But our two debaters were Sara Fuentes, the vice president for government affairs at the Transportation Institute, and Colin Grabow, an associate director at the Cato Institute's Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies. Sara took the pro side and Colin took the anti side. And as I said, we had some pretty good arguments on both sides. So take a listen, see if it changes your mind. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you probably already have an opinion, but here we go. Before we start, I got to ask, how many people have heard of the Jones Act here? Oh.
Wait, actually, let's just hear, get a temperature of both sides. So shout if you think the Jones Act should be repealed. And shout if you think we should keep the Jones Act.
Wow. Shout if you just feel strongly about the Jones Act either way. Yeah, all right. Everyone has an opinion. Okay, we are giving up on our longest running joke and finally doing the Jones Act episode. We thought we'd do something a little bit special. Instead of just having one guest, we actually have two. It's going to be an Odd Lots debate, someone arguing the pro side and someone on the con side.
That's right. We're not going to formally declare a winner.
Everyone's a winner.
There's
tonight.
not formal rules in terms of, there's no mic mute or anything. But we are going to have a spirited discussion about this very controversial law. People feel really strongly about this law one way or another. And so we are going to we don't actually do a lot of debates on the show, actually.
It's a rule at my house that you can't talk about politics or the Jones Act
That's
or
right.
crypto at Thanksgiving. Okay. So without further ado, we do have the perfect guest. We're going to be speaking with Sara Fuentes. She is the vice president for government affairs at the Transportation Institute. And we have Colin Grabow. He is a policy analyst at the Cato Institute. So welcome to the stage, Sara and Colin.
All right, Colin and Sara, thank you so much. We're finally talking the Jones Act. Colin, why don't we start with you? Why should we get rid of the... Why did you even agree to come out here and talk about some random shipping law from the early 1900s? And why do you devote time to it? And why do you want to kill it?
Well, Joe, Tracy, first off, thanks for having me to debate this issue. Thanks for ending the long-running joke and finally talking about it. So the Jones Act. Well, why am I so against it? Well, I think the U.S. maritime policy should try to achieve two goals. It should provide us with efficient domestic transportation by water, which is really important because we have lots of water in the United States. We have thousands of miles of coastline home to major metropolitan areas. We have the Great Lakes. We have a vast network of inland waterways. We have the non-contiguous states and territories. So we have this big resource and we totally underutilize it by making the cost of transportation so expensive. The other thing we need to do is meet national security goals. We need to have shipyards. We need to have ships. We need to have mariners to crew those ships. And I don't think the Jones Act does a good job of meeting either one of those goals. So I talked about shipping, water transport being expensive. Why is that? Well, we should back up and say, what does the Jones Act do? Well, the Jones Act...
Everyone's giving history lessons tonight, so you might as well go all the way back.
So the Jones Act is Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which essentially states that if you want to move goods by water, you have to use a vessel that meets 4 conditions. It has to be U.S. flagged, it has to be U.S. built, it has to be crewed by Americans, and it has to be at least 75% owned by Americans. Now, these provisions make water transportation extremely expensive. Less than 1% of the world's ships comply with the U.S. flag requirement. That means that 99% of the world's ships are off the table if you want to move something within the United States. If you look at a map of all the ships operating in U.S. waters, they're full of foreign ships. We have foreign ships everywhere. We can't use them. So right there, that's less supply. The U.S. flag ships are about 4 times more expensive to operate than foreign flag ships. And when it comes to building that ship, they cost about 4 to 5 times more to build than those built overseas. So that has huge capital costs. You put that combination together and you're going to get very expensive shipping. How expensive? There was a Federal Reserve Bank of New York study in 2012 that found it was twice as expensive to send a container from the East Coast to Puerto Rico, where the Jones Act applies, as to send to neighboring Jamaica or the Dominican Republic. In 2017, the CEO of a Jones Act shipping company admitted that Jones Act tankers were 3 to 4 times more expensive than internationally flagged tankers. I mean, just yesterday, a state senator in Connecticut, testified before the state legislature saying that his first job out of college, he used to work in bulk shipping, and that moving goods within the United States was 5, sometimes 10 times more expensive than using internationally flagged vessels. So this is the profound cost. I mean, distance is a barrier to a trade between Americans, and this makes water transportation incredibly expensive. It's a barrier to us doing business with each other.
Okay, so the one thing we can agree on is America is #blessed in terms of inland waterways. But Sara, I want to bring you in, so feel free to give us your own history lesson, but the Jones Act doesn't exist just to boost prices of shipping. There are other reasons, such as security. So why don't we go way back in history and talk a little bit more about why this act actually exists?
Sure. So the reasons for the Jones Act are the same today as they were when it passed in 1920, and also some form of Jones Act can also be referred to as cabotage laws. Some form of cabotage law has existed.
What's cabotage mean again?
It basically means if you're moving goods between 2 points, that you want those goods to move on a vessel registered to your country.
Okay.
Right? And it's really extremely common. 80% of the world's coastline is governed by some form of cabotage. You see it in other industries, right? You can't take Air China from New York to LA. Right? So it's extremely common across modes, across the world. But I love the Jones Act, and I love it so much. I like to put the reasons I like it into 3 categories: economic security, national security, and homeland security. Economic security is pretty obvious, right? Because of that U.S. crew, U.S.-owned requirement, it's created about 650,000 jobs, 615,001 if you include Colin's. And also all those jobs are for Americans, right? Those Americans are paying taxes. Those companies are paying American taxes. That economic security also includes self-sufficiency, which especially matters in our non-contiguous trades, which I hope we get into a little bit more. The men and women who crew our Jones Act vessels are the exact same people who crew our sealift vessels in time of emergency. Not only that, but you also get a shipyard industrial base. I've heard you all talk on this show. You all well know that Navy shipbuilding is really feast or famine, right? There's a lot of unpredictability in that market. And so the Jones Act is kind of a final line of defense that ensures you do have some shipyard workers, you have a shipyard industrial base that can be spun up when needed. Third category is homeland security, right? That's pretty obvious. You don't want to just open up our beautiful inland waterways, our Great Lakes, to the cheapest option. The U.S. flag that Colin mentioned matters quite a bit, right? It means that our vessels are inspected by the Coast Guard. We know that they're not polluting and leaking. It means that the mariners are known by the Coast Guard. They've gone through background checks. They've been trained to the highest standard worldwide. And so think about those inland waterways. Those are, those run by stadiums, they run by refineries, they run by personal homes. You don't want to just have whoever there just because they happen to be the cheapest and save a couple bucks.
Okay, but thank you, first of all. And I take your point about the 650,000 jobs, but, there's 300-something million Americans who aren't employed by the Jones Act. Per Colin's argument, paying more for any goods. Why should the rest of us 330 million Americans who aren't employed, and me and Tracy maybe partially because it comes up so often, who aren't Jones Act employed, what about the cost of that?
So
why should we be bearing that cost?
So I take issue with the cost argument, right?
Okay.
I don't necessarily think that's true. You can look at the U.S. Virgin Islands, right, which does not have the Jones Act, and compare prices there to Puerto Rico, and you'll see that the Virgin Islands is actually more expensive. And what matters to consumers isn't just cost anyway, right? It's reliability. It's that stability in the marketplace and knowing everybody is playing by the same set of rules, knowing that shipment will show up, and that really matters. And also, I would say, the Jones Act doesn't involve any government dollars, right? So the taxpayer is not paying to subsidize this fleet. But if you got rid of the Jones Act, you would have to eventually pay for those mariners, pay for the shipyard workers, and make those investments. So the government's going to pay for that regardless. So do you want it to be taxpayer dollars, or do you want it to be ameliorated and sort of baked into something, just the cost of doing business in the United States?
I think it's helpful for these types of things to think about the counterfactual sometimes. So I'm going to ask both of you to respond to this question. But if we got rid of the Jones Act tomorrow, waved a magic maritime wand or whatever, and it went away, what would the world look like? Let's do Colin first.
Well, I think that's a great question, because the real cost of the Jones Act is not that it costs X amount of dollars more to send a container to Puerto Rico. It's what does the United States look like with the Jones Act versus what does the United States look like without the Jones Act. And the United States without the Jones Act is a country that is better connected to each other through more efficient supply chains. We can envision, for example, right now we make shipment of oil so expensive that we export it all over the place, but East Coast refineries will import it from, say, Nigeria or Saudi Arabia instead of Texas because it's just not competitive after you factor in the cost of shipping. Some goods are impossible to ship within the United States because of the Jones Act. The United States is one of the world's leading exporters of liquefied petroleum gas, basically propane. Puerto Rico buys it from foreign sources. Hawaii buys it from as far away as West Africa, not because it's more expensive. There are 0 ships to transport it. It's literally impossible because of the Jones Act. We've seen examples of lumber producers in the Pacific Northwest saying, look, when we go to send our lumber to other parts of the United States, we're getting beat out by Canadian competitors that can use more efficient international shipping. So we're being put on the back foot. We've seen government reports cite examples of steel in the Western United States being purchased from Asia instead of Eastern producers. Why? Because multiple times it says Jones Act shipping makes it uncompetitive for Americans to sell to other Americans. So we think about all the supply chains that would be better connected, all the efficiencies that would bring. On the more micro level, you can think of, say, ferry operators in Washington State that could buy ferries at a third of the cost of what they're paying now to modernize their fleets and improve transportation. So I think that the difference between the U.S. as is versus without the Jones Act, it would be a huge, huge gain.
Sara?
I'm glad you asked that. World without the Jones Act is a pretty scary place, right? Because I want you to remember the context. I'm serious. I want you to think about the context we're living in, right? The People's Republic of China has made a strategic decision to overinvest in its own maritime capability. They are deliberately undermining the prices, lowballing the prices for shipbuilding, for shipping services, for ship-to-shore cranes. They want to be the only provider out there, right? They want the whole world to be dependent on them for shipping because they know that is the backbone of commerce, right? Is how we transport these goods. So if we wave that magic wand, first off, those 650,000 people would be out of work, which would be a drain on your taxpayers, right? So we would have to pay for that. You would basically eliminate the American shipbuilding industry overnight because even Japan, even South Korea cannot keep up with Chinese subsidies. They are exiting the container ship market. They're exiting other shipbuilding markets. So absolutely, China would swoop in and do that. You would also have ships of unknown provenance, right? But they'd probably be owned by China through various shell companies, crewed by unvetted mariners, sailing, moving hazardous materials at best case, up and down our inland waterways past all these soft targets. So if you wanted to keep that security on the seas, right, you would have to, quadruple the size of the Coast Guard or the CBP to do those vessel inspections. Right now, Coast Guard, CBP, are active at international ports, certain ports where foreign vessels can come and visit. But you would have to really increase that. I mean, keep in mind, the Coast Guard is smaller than the NYPD. They do not have the bandwidth to handle all these unregistered ships that we don't know how safe they are. We don't know how much they're polluting. You don't know who's on there. I think it is very scary. I was totally serious.
To Colin's point about, various entities within the United States having to import, and you talked about national security or economic security, and the fact that for basic commodities, for example, at times when there's a really tough winter in New England, that we can't ship LNG from Houston to New England. Doesn't that create an economic vulnerability for the U.S., the fact that we can't supply ourselves with our own raw materials in certain instances?
So I don't think that's true. And I think that your New England LNG example is a really good one, right? Because what happens all too frequently is the Jones Act becomes a cover and a scapegoat for other policy failures, right? New England has an energy policy issue that I love ships, but the cheapest, most efficient way to move natural gas is as gas in a pipeline, right?
They're not into pipelines. I know, yeah, they're not into pipelines.
They also don't have storage capacity, right? Which means they cannot buy natural gas during low season. They're only ever buying it at peak. And their need is erratic, so they don't have a long-term charter. They're buying it on the spot market. And what's really expensive about liquefied natural gas is that liquefaction. So if you were to take gas out of Pennsylvania, first you got to move it down a pipeline, you got to liquefy it, and then move it, and then regasify it. And then you can only do this in very small amounts, right? Which is going to be more expensive, because what really matters is that kind of volume. So even if the transportation were free, you're already looking at having to charge quite a lot of money for gas in New England, right? So even though it's free, you still are going to bear that cost. So in order for gas in New England to be cheap, you would have to force energy producers and those kind of liquefying facilities to do this at below market rate, right? We're in a capitalist society, so people are going to look for the cheapest option. And sometimes the cheapest option is not going to be American. So the liquefied natural gas is a great example.
Colin, could I ask you to respond to the sort of national security point? Because when you hear statistics like the Coast Guard is smaller than the New York police force, that seems pretty worrying.
Yeah, so a couple arguments that have been made here. One is about the alleged danger of foreign ships and having them in our waters. Folks, the choice here is not, do we let foreign ships into our waters or do we not? They're here. They're already here. You can go on marinetraffic.com. It will show you all the ships in U.S. waters. You can find foreign ships sailing up to Albany, New York. You can see them sailing past Philadelphia, up to New Orleans, up to Sacramento. The Jones Act doesn't say you can't come into U.S. waters. It just regulates what you can do within U.S. waters. So they're here. And talk about hazardous materials. I mean, they're all the tankers coming out of Houston, Corpus Christi with energy products. I mean, the vast majority are foreign. So they're already here. We have Customs and Border Protection. We have the Coast Guard to inspect these vessels. They are subject to port state control. So I find that a bit of a red herring. With regard to the issue with China, I find this ironic because Jones Act shipping companies are some of the biggest patrons of Chinese shipyards. I mentioned earlier that U.S.-built ships are incredibly expensive, 4 to 5 times more. Well, one result of this is that people don't want to buy new ships. So they keep old ships going for a long time. Internationally, ships are used for 20, 25, 30 years. The last 17 Jones Act ships that were scrapped had an average age of 43. So they keep these old ships running, and they do it by sending them to China to get maintained at Chinese state-owned shipyards, and they turn around and use the money they save from going to China instead of a U.S. or an allied shipyard and say, please keep the Jones Act in place. It's really critical for our national security to stop China. I mean, we're joking, but this is real life. I mean, 2 years ago, a Jones Act shipping company, Pasha, they took a 43-year-old ship built in 1980, and it was built with steam power. So instead of supporting U.S. shipyards, buying a new ship, no. They sent to China, ripped out the steam power, put in LNG, spent tens of millions of dollars to do so we can keep running for years to come. And then we tell ourselves this is all about national security. I think it's farcical.
Sara?
Yeah, sure. Shipyard repair and shipbuilding are two very distinct industries. And you're correct, we don't have the shipyard repair work in the United States that we should have. I'm very glad I'm not a businessman. I don't have to make these types of business decisions. But frankly, you can't really get ship repair work done even in our allies because China has lowballed that market so much.
Why isn't there more of a shipbuilding industry, given the existence of the Jones Act and the theoretical natural demand or the theoretical demand that creates? Why is shipbuilding so meager in the United States? And why aren't they building more Jones Act compliant ships right now, given the evident scarcity?
Sure. So the reason you don't see as much shipping as I would like is frankly because we've chosen as a nation to make investments in other modes, right? If shipping was subsidized in the same way that trucking was, right? Think about the highway system. Think about pipelines. Think about all these other areas where a lot of goods have moved. So the shipbuilding market is right-sized for the Jones Act, right? So we are, right now we build enough ships that we need for the Jones Act market. We don't scrap super easily like China does because scrapping is expensive and bad for the environment. So yeah, we like to extend the useful life of our vessels as much as possible. We don't do a scrap and rebuild pricing scheme like China does, right? Which is a big part of it. And I wish that we did build more ships for the international market. And I think we may see a shift in that, right? Like from the Ships for America Act and some other areas. But what's really been happening is in the 1980s, the United States decided to step away from construction subsidies, which are very strong in the rest of the world, right? So the United States decides we're not going to do any more shipbuilding subsidies. You have to build here, but you have to use American laws, American workers, et cetera. And at the same time that we did that, South Korea, Japan, Europe, all invested trillions in terms of subsidies, in terms of financial schemes, and other options. What China has done is really astounding. CSIS has a new report out this year about how they're just flooding the market with tonnage to try and drive out all other shipbuilders. So you're seeing even our allies having to close their shipyards and decrease their shipbuilding because of the unfair playing field that's done by China. So if you say, let's get rid of the Jones Act, let's get rid of this US build requirement, you're basically throwing our shipyards to the wolves, right? And saying, okay, you keep fighting by American rules, you have to pay minimum wage standards, you have to have safety standards, and you have to go fight against a shipyard in China where people don't even have shoes on. Right? It's not a fair fight. So if we were living in a perfect free market world, we'd be having a different discussion, but we're not. Shipbuilding is a strategic asset.
All right, I'm going to ask a sort of middle ground question in an attempt to reconcile both positions. But let's say you don't get to throw away the Jones Act, but you get to make a change to it, and you get to keep the Jones Act, but you have to make a change to it.
Good question.
What would the response be? Sara, let's start with you.
The change I would make to the Jones Act is that I would add shipbuilding subsidies.
Oh, okay. Colin?
I would absolutely get rid of the U.S. build requirement. The notion that we promote, forget the economic effects here, just the notion that we promote a healthy maritime industry by forcing Americans to pay outrageous prices for new ships is on its face absurd. We heard talk earlier about, we need it to preserve shipbuilding. Well, how's that worked out? A GAO report last month referenced the U.S. shipbuilding industry as in a state of near total collapse. The Wall Street Journal just last week had an article that referred to the U.S. shipbuilding industry as tiny and rusty. In 2023, the most recent year for which we have data, the U.S. accounted for 0.1% of global shipbuilding output. Obviously, we're well behind China, but folks, we're behind Norway, the Netherlands. I think in 2022, we're behind Croatia. This is the United States, one of the biggest manufacturers in the world, an incredibly inventive, dynamic economy, and this is what we've been reduced to. It's shameful, and it's an indictment of what the Jones Act has done.
Well, actually, I want to ask you about this. Do you accept, Cato I associate with not industrial policy, sort of true laissez-faire. Do you accept the premise, setting aside how we get there, do you accept the premise that the U.S. should have more domestic shipbuilding?
I think that we should have, I defer to the national security experts what we should have, but absolutely we should have it. And the Jones Act does not give it to us. So I'm not against government intervention per se. So, for example, I think we need ships. I'm not against subsidizing ships where the government says, here's money in exchange in time of war. We get to grab that ship and use that. That makes sense to me. You can do a cost-benefit analysis. The X much money gets you, this many ships. We can't do that with the Jones Act. Let's stop doing things that don't work and do things that do work.
So I would take issue with the fact that you say that U.S. shipbuilding is expensive. Shipbuilding is expensive. It's expensive everywhere. Our shipbuilding is right priced, right? Everybody else is cheating is kind of what's going on. Like all these countries you mentioned have heavy subsidies, financial schemes. Look at the two biggest cost drivers in shipbuilding are labor and steel components, right? And so, of course, labor is more expensive in the United States. That's true for every American industry, right? We have a higher standard of living. We pay taxes. And then look at steel. The top steel producer in the world is China. Do you think that they are charging market prices for their steel? No, of course not.
If I may. So I think there may be a notion here that people think, okay, things were okay and then China came along, or the U.S. is okay and then South Korea came along, or things were okay and then Japan came along. Folks, U.S. shipbuilding has been internationally uncompetitive since the Civil War. Okay, this is not something that happened recently. It's been going on, and nobody is buying ships from Norway instead of the United States because of the cheap wages. That's absurd. There was an article I remember like 15, 20 years ago that said that Dutch shipyards were building ships at 1/3 the U.S. price and paying their workers 20 to 40% more. It's indefensible.
There's a question about the Jones Act that I've had for a long time, and I want to get your take on it, Colin. We did this interview with John Arnold, the philanthropist. He does a lot of stuff with policies. And we asked him, we talked about YIMBY stuff and highways and stuff. And we were like, and Tracy said, well, what do you think about would you put any effort towards repealing the Jones Act? He's like, I'm not even going to try. That one's not going anywhere. Can you describe to me 650,000 people, I don't know, whatever. Why, given the meager size of the U.S. shipbuilding industry, is it perceived that this law is so hard to dislodge?
It seems like such a political hot potato for some reason.
Yeah, so the question is, why is this law so difficult? Why does it remain in place, despite my criticism of people like me and whatnot? I would submit this is a tribute to the power of special interests. I can come up with, off the top of my head, probably...
But it's apparently not a big one.
I can,
according to both of you.
It's a small industry, yes. So Sara referenced 650,000 jobs. That's based on a study that calculated there were somewhere like 98,000 jobs actually in the domestic maritime industry. Each one of those has a multiplier of 5, and then you add those together, and that's
so in theory that should make it even less of
it's a small industry, right? So why does it remain in place? And the dynamic is this. There are any number of organizations dedicated to preserving the Jones Act. There's the American Maritime Partnership, where Sara is also, vice president, I believe, the Transportation Institute, the Lake Carriers Association, the Offshore Marine Service Association, the American Waterway Operators, the Marine Engineers Beneficial Association, Seafarers International Union, I go on and on. I can't think of any industry in D.C., an association where task priority 1, 2, or 3 is get rid of the Jones Act. In fact, I've had conversations with folks where they say something like, look, I hate the Jones Act. I think it hurts our industry, but on my top 10 list of issues, it's like number 4 or 5. And for issues 1, 2, and 3, I need the support of senators that support the Jones Act. And this is a dynamic you see over and over again. It's concentrated benefits, dispersed costs. The people that care the most about the Jones Act, that think this is existential to me, are the people and the companies in the industry. Those and they allocate their resources accordingly. So you can find any number of ridiculous laws like the U.S. Sugar Program, same basic dynamic. We see it over and over and over again.
Sara, I'm going to give you the chance to respond. Why are you so good at your job?
No, it's easy. The Jones Act is popular. It's been popular with Republicans. It's popular with Democrats. It's popular across administrations. It's also really popular with the United States military. Heads of Transportation Command, Military Sealift Command, the Navy have been asked about this multiple times, and they all find a lot of value in it. They know that if you didn't have that, we would see our shipbuilding capability, and most importantly, we would lose those mariners, right? These mariners that crew these sealift ships, they need time at sea to train, to be ready, to move up in their ratings, right? So they need that work as well, so they can be called upon when they need. And they answer the call. They've answered the call many, many times. In every war, you've had a merchant marine component, and it's critical. So it's successful because it's popular, it's well loved. It's extremely effective. Like I said, you're going to pay these costs regardless. So do we want to spread it out? We're all in a society here. We all share. We all enjoy these benefits. The savings that Colin is talking about is a rounding error. The reason laws don't exist just to save us money, right? That's not how you determine if a law is good or not. Does it save people a couple of pennies? Or let's be real, does it save shippers a couple of pennies, right? Like, even if Colin's cost arguments are accurate, are those cost savings going to be passed down to the consumer?
I mean, costs are costs. I don't know.
All right, we could go on and on and on, but a big round of applause for these two. It's not easy to come on stage and debate these things, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Tracy, I'm so glad we finally did the Jones Act episode. And to be honest, it actually fulfilled all of my hopes and wishes for the episode.
That's good. Did it change your mind at all?
Did it change my mind? I mean, that presupposes that I had an opinion. I guess what I would say...
that's right. You don't have opinions.
What I would say is that at least if we think that shipbuilding in the U.S. is important, and I think I am convinced of that, the Jones Act, our current structure, is clearly not sufficing.
Yeah, I would broadly agree with that, because if you look at, I guess, it's sort of the proof is in the pudding, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the outcome of the Jones Act, it hasn't actually been that successful in terms of American shipbuilding. One funny thing, right before we recorded this, we asked the audience who was in favor of the Jones Act and who was against it. And I swear, it was pretty evenly split, but also everyone in the audience raised their hand at one point or another.
Yeah,
everyone
so
has
polarizing.
an opinion on the Jones Act.
I know. It is really polarizing. And I thought, our guests, I did a good job of having it be kind of heated, intense on stage. Of course, it was very civil and a good conversation. But I thought from listening to Colin and Sara that, you actually got a pretty good sense of how strongly the opposite sides feel about this very old law.
Oh, yeah, totally. It was a great rundown of the arguments for and against, for sure. All right, shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow our guests, Colin Grabow. He's at CP Grabow. And Sara Fuentes. Actually, she's not on X, probably wisely, but you can follow the Transportation Institute at trans_INST. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armand, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, and Cale Brooks at Cale Brooks. For more Odd Lots content, go to Bloomberg.com/oddlots, where we have all of our episodes in a daily newsletter. And you can chat about all of these topics, including plenty more Jones Act talk, in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoy Odd Lots, if you want us to do more debates, then please leave us a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. And remember, if you are a Bloomberg subscriber, you can listen to all of our episodes absolutely ad-free. All you need to do is find the Bloomberg channel on Apple Podcasts and follow the instructions there. Thanks for listening.